Listen, it's unreasonable for me to finish every game I ever play. Although I certainly try. That's the goal, right? But every now and again, one slips through the cracks, for whatever reason, we fall off. You get distracted by the new shiny thing, or maybe the game isn't really what you were expecting, or just in general, it's not the right game at the right time. So today I thought it would be fun to talk through 5 games that I fell off of, that I did not finish, and that I probably won't go back to, although that's not always true in every case here. But who knows, right? First up, we're just going to dive right in. The first game is the sequel to a game I really loved on the PlayStation 3. The sequel came out on the PlayStation Portable, and that is Valkyria Chronicles 2. I was really excited when this one got announced. The PS3 game, as I said, was one that I really loved. It was high up on my, Game of the Year list at that time. I don't know if I was making formal Game of the Year lists when that game came out, but it would have been in my top 10 for sure. I played all the way through it. Huge fan. I was telling all my friends to play it. I was like going back in and doing, alternate builds and buffing different characters. It just had this really great blend of that top-down strategic view and boots on the ground kind of action. And I thought that they struck that balance uniquely. And plus, great visual aesthetic, great music, all that stuff. So when the sequel came out, I was pumped. And this one had an interesting premise. It was set in a school or like a military, kind of battle academy like that. So sort of Fire Emblem Three Houses-ish before Fire Emblem Three Houses did it. We were, kind of learning these characters as recruits. And, they were a little bit more green, a little more wet behind the ears, things like that. And so I picked it up, dove in, and at first it seemed like this was everything I would want out of a sequel, right? It was like, more Valkyria Chronicles. You could tell it was going to be a longer game. You could tell that they'd made some tweaks to the battle system, some changes to, the upgrades and all that. And I wasn't too bothered at first by the fact that it was on PSP, I think a lot of people were sour that it was a portable sequel to a console game. I don't always necessarily mind that, but that's only true if the move to portable doesn't impact it in any major ways. And unfortunately, at least for me, Valkyria Chronicles 2 was impacted in the map layouts. That was the big, kind of deal breaker. So if you've never played it before, in the first Valkyria Chronicles, it all takes place on these giant open maps, like cityscapes or landscapes, Think of a traditional RTS, because it's an RTS hybrid shooter. You think of one big connected map that you're going to, place pieces on, move around, things like that. But in this game, probably because the PSP couldn't load all those locations, that much data all at one time, the maps are split into multiple sub-maps, and then there's certain points of connection between them. And so you'll have a small handful of characters, maybe like 2 or 3 in this one little map section, and when you move them to the edge of that screen, then they'll move to the next map, which means that you are sort of juggling multiple locations and things like that. And ultimately, it just kind of lowered the scale of the battles and made everything a little bit more finicky, harder to keep track of everything, and just less fun, Your options were more limited because you probably only had a small handful of pieces. You could do fewer maneuvers, less of bait and flank and all that type of stuff that made the first game fun. It was a little more just kind of direct combat as a result. Plus, I feel like the story wasn't really quite as gripping as the first one. That might just be a personal thing, but ultimately it seemed a little bit slower. The pacing was a little worse. I think because this game uses a calendar system. So you play through the course of a year or so. And so I imagine that they had the certain story beats they wanted to hit at certain times. And there's just maybe not enough of them to fill an entire calendar year. And so you really get some drag in the pacing. Things slow down and you end up kind of just feeling it's like a filler arc in an anime, right? So I ultimately did not finish this despite loving the first one as much as I do. And to be honest, I'm not really super motivated to go back. At this point, I got about halfway, a little over halfway. And I don't really remember what was happening in the story at that point. I would be pretty out of my element in terms of, what my character's builds were and how to play, so I probably would need to restart. And I just don't necessarily see myself doing it. So I've moved on from Valkyria Chronicles 2. Not the sequel I was necessarily hoping for. Not a terrible game, just not what I was hoping for. All right. Number 2. Another RPG that I did not make it all the way through. A much more recent one this time. And one that I was really looking forward to when it was first announced, but unfortunately it did not grip me. And that is Cris Tales. I believe that I talked about this one a bit in a recent trophy video, but for folks that didn't see that video, or just as a refresher, Cris Tales came out a couple of years ago, at least as the time of recording this, and it had a little bit of hype, you know? It had some pre-release excitement because it has a really interesting premise. It's a game where they're utilizing the mechanic of time in the battle system itself. So, you know, classic RPGs out there exist that use time as a story mechanic. You know, Chrono Trigger comes to mind, amongst others. And they do it very effectively. But this game was adding an extra layer to that in that you could move back and forth in time during actual battles. So in practice, that meant you could jump into the past, apply some status effects, then jump in the future and see, you know, kind of a burst of damage from all of those status effects. Or jump in the past or stay in the present and cast a water spell on an enemy wearing metal armor, then jump into the future and their armor would rust and their defense would lower. Really cool idea. And in the end, they just didn't utilize enough of that. There wasn't enough variety. It didn't really change things up too much. And in general, it was just a little bit slow and honestly kind of boring. Like, the story was just boring. I couldn't tell you any of the characters' names. I couldn't tell you anything about it. I remember just like waiting for it to get good, and it kind of never got good. So this is one of the biggest examples of premise not living up to its potential for me. This one more than Valkyria Chronicles 2, I have a bit of an urge to go back and try again. Like, maybe it would spark something now, or maybe I was just before it got good. I'm not really sure, but as it stands, I played about 5-6 hours of this, and just every time I went to boot up the PlayStation 5, it was a chore. I was struggling to get the motivation. I was struggling to want to play, and eventually I just stopped. So that is Cris Tales. If it does get good, though, please let me know. I would love to know that this game has that it delivers. You just have to, you know, play it a little longer. Again, none of these are bad games. It's just ones that didn't really click for me, and Cris Tales wasn't it. All right, third one. We're going back in time for this one. Not all the way back to, you know, NES, Super Nintendo, but we're going back to the PlayStation 2, a game that I bought right around launch from GameStop. You know, I think pre-owned pretty shortly after it came out. And that is Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne. This is the original one. I know that it's been released. You know, there's like an HD version that came out on more modern platforms. But this is the version I played back in the day. And this is the version that I gave up on. So, why did I give up on Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne? This game, more than any others, I don't have a good reason. I really don't. I almost feel guilty about it. I want to say maybe 7 hours into the game, 7-8 hours. I think I even got through, there's like a famously difficult boss fight somewhere in there. And I want to say I got through that. Maybe I didn't. But I remember I was really liking the vibe. This is the first Shin Megami Tensei game I ever played. I think I played this before I even played Persona or anything like that. So I was brand new to this world, these character designs, everything. And I loved the vibe. You know, it's so moody and dark and just kind of, you know, weird and like slightly off-putting in an interesting way. Yeah, really, it sucked you in. You know, it gave you a really good sense of place. And I thought the battle system was fun too. You know, I liked the interactions that you have with the demons. I liked that it was a little bit more difficult than your traditional turn-based RPG. All of that was fun to me. But I just fell off. And interestingly for this one, I knew I was going to fall off. Around this time, I was kind of really getting into tracking my backlog. And I'm not sure if, you know, this came out at a time when other games came out too, and I just got distracted by other stuff. But I put this game down, and when I did, I must have known I was not coming back for a while. Now, granted, I played this around when it came out back in 2004. So this is 20 years ago I put this down. And when I did, I'll open up my copy here. See, I left this note to myself. This is my handwriting 20 years ago. You know, potential spoilers here about what the midsection of this game looks like. But I wrote this note that literally tells me where to go and what I need to be doing I say search the world map and find a place with a long name starting with M. I didn't even want to write the actual name of the place. I was like, I don't know what that's called. I'm just going to describe it in a way that I understand myself. And it says, love you. Piece of graph paper I ripped out of probably my high school notebook at the time. I wrote myself a note saying what the heck I was supposed to do in this game, because I had the foresight to know that I was abandoning it. And since then, I've never gone back. I'm assuming I still have the save file. It's probably on one of my old memory cards here, but certainly not any context for what I was doing. Again, 2 decades ago. This is like over half my life ago that I played this game. So I would really like to reboot it back up and pick up from that note. I feel like it would be a disservice to my past self to just start a fresh file on like the HD version. And so I will probably go back to this one at some point. I just need to have the time carved out to where this is kind of my main focus RPG. But has that ever happened to you? Have you ever had a game where you kind of knew you were abandoning it in real time? You know, a lot of times I think many of us, especially for RPGs, we set a game down, you know, maybe we play another game for a little bit, and we always tell ourselves we're going to go back. You know, I'm going to go back to that one. But as soon as I finish this game, I'll go back to it. Or I'm going to play this game a little bit, then I'll hop right back in. But we don't always do it, right? A lot of times it just never happens, and suddenly years go by and you haven't gone back to that file. But sometimes, you know, deep, you know, that little voice in the back of your head is saying, you're giving this up, man. Save yourself the pain. Write a note on graph paper what you're supposed to do. All right, let's stick with PS2 for my 4th game here, and that is going to be another sequel to a game I really love. Maybe that's kind of a trend, honestly, with this stack, is sequels that I don't stick with as long as I did the original game. And this is genuinely one of my favorite games of all time, certainly one of my favorite games on the PlayStation 2, the original. And the follow-up is Dark Cloud 2. I am a massive original Dark Cloud fan. If folks pay attention to a lot of my videos, you'll hear Dark Cloud music in the background because I love the soundtrack. And I just think it's kind of perfectly emblematic of the vibe of the PS2. It's cozy, it's warm, plays great, runs at 60 FPS, good dungeon crawling. You know, I like the overworld kind of building sections and stuff like that. So when Dark Cloud 2 was announced, I was there. I was ready. We got this thing ASAP. And unfortunately, what happened is the sequel of it all destroyed my motivation. So this is a lesson in you don't always need to just keep adding things on top. What they did is they took this really great foundation in the original Dark Cloud of, you know, dungeoning, upgrading your weapons, finding pieces to the town, going back, constructing the town, and trying to make sure that you meet the needs of the different townspeople in how the towns are built. And then they just added a bunch of extra layers and extra systems into this game. So you have all these like extra customization options. It feels much less like Lego pieces and much more like an actual kind of city builder when you're rebuilding the cities. They added a bunch of extra like side objectives and things you can do. You can play golf in this game. All right, you can play golf in a Dark Cloud game. Now, the golf rules, but that's just emblematic of the problem. And so I was playing it and I'm like, this doesn't quite have the heart, like the charm of the original. It's almost like it's trying too hard. Now, this is probably my favorite of all the games that I have here, even over Shin Megami Tensei Nocturn. I still do like it, but I never can keep any kind of motivation to play through it. I played it multiple times back in the day. I've started a new file on the PS4 version that came out. I streamed the intro, hoping that it would kickstart another playthrough for me at some point in the future. Every time, I just can't do it. Something about the story doesn't grab me, and all those extra mechanics just kind of drowned me a little bit in terms of stuff to think about. So let me know, how do you feel about Dark Cloud 2? You know, Dark Cloud 2. Is this your preferred game of the two of them? I feel like maybe a lot of people feel the same way I do because we never got a third one. But man, give us a Dark Cloud 3, please. That's a game I so desperately want. But yeah, I dropped off that one. I think I was at like the third town or so. I remember it was like an underwater, or it was like a water-themed area. So if that's the third, my memory is good. If it's not the third, I apologize. And our final game for the day that I couldn't get through, that I gave up on, is a 3DS title, yet another sequel to a game I like, and that is Bravely Second End Layer. So don't get confused. This is not Bravely Default 2, which is the third game in the series. This is Bravely Second, the second game in the series. And this, even though it's Bravely Second, it feels like an in-between of those two games, right? It's almost like a spin-off where, at least as far as I got, it seems like the stakes are just lower in this one. And so when I got this game, I got this thing day one. I was ready because I played all the way through Bravely Default, loved it. Boom, I was here. Played through it probably 4 or 5 hours. That seems to be about the time I give a game that I'm going to end up dropping. It might have been more like 10. And I ended up just losing motivation, losing steam, didn't get much further. And then several years later, we were hanging out with my cousin-in-law. And he brought his 3DS and also Bravely Second. And so we decided to kind of like tandem play it together. So it's not like it's multiplayer or co-op or anything, but we were both sitting there on our 3DSs, both playing through. We started new files at the same time. And so we could talk about the progress that we'd made, and we could swap stories and strategies and, what classes are you leveling up? What jobs are effective for you? What are good combinations, good builds? And that was pretty fun. I think we did that for the first 7 to 10 hours. And then after that weekend was over, he went home. I continued to play for another 5 hours or so. But again, once I wasn't playing alongside him and I was just kind of left to my own devices, I just couldn't find that urge, that thrust to continue playing. Instead, it felt like I was pulling teeth every time I needed to boot it up. It was like nothing felt like it was happening in the story. It just kind of was like aimlessly going from town to town. And sometimes that type of storytelling can be good. Right now, as of the time of recording this, I'm playing Dragon Quest VI. And a lot of those DS Dragon Quest games, or those, middle Dragon Quest games, they're almost structured like an anime, where you play through these 30 to 60 minute episodes that are just like mini stories. The stakes are relatively low, and then you move on to a new town, and there's really no relationship to the story that you were just doing. There is an overarching story, but it's really a series of small events that lead to this large event with very little connective tissue. And I like that game a lot. I think it's very effective. It's got great pacing, and they do really well with those. But when something like Bravely Second does it, for some reason, the way that it's implemented, the way it's executed, it just feels like treading water. It feels like they didn't have enough for a full game, and instead just needed to kind of find excuses to send you into the battle system. And the battle system continues to be awesome in this game. It's super fun. The job system continues to be awesome in this game. Super fun. It was really the story, I think, and the pacing that kept me from continuing. May boot this one back up at some point in the future. Try to dust that save file off. I don't think I would restart it a third time, but I might be able to, hook a little bit of a tide, a little bit of a jet stream back into the story and see it through. So that's the 5 games, mostly RPGs, all RPGs actually, that I gave up on, that I could not finish. What are some RPGs or some games in general that you gave up on for whatever reason, right? Were they too hard? Were they too slow? Did you forget about them because other fancier, shinier games came out? Let me know. And until next time, peace.